For over 60 years, Margaret Ellison lived a life defined by structure and predictability. A retired attorney from Charleston, South Carolina, Margaret's days were deliberate and methodical. She wasn't impulsive, nor was she reckless. Life had taught her the value of careful planning and quiet dignity. She had never been one to seek out conflict. In fact, she had spent most of her career de-escalating it. But none of that mattered when Officer Daniel Briggs walked into the small neighborhood market on a slow Tuesday afternoon in Ashford, Mississippi. The town of Ashford was the kind of place where people recognized each other's cars more than their faces. On that quiet day, Margaret had stopped by to pick up two simple things: a loaf of whole-grain bread and a half-gallon of skim milk. She was on her way home to prepare dinner when everything changed. As she stepped away from the self-checkout station, paper bag cradled in her arms, Margaret felt it, that subtle but unmistakable prickle along her neck. She was being watched. "Ma'am, I need you to stop right there." The voice cut through the quiet hum of the store like a sharp blade. Margaret turned, her face calm though her heart had already picked up its pace. A tall man in a dark blue uniform approached her. Officer Briggs rested one hand casually on the butt of his holstered weapon. The look on his face was unreadable, but his posture suggested a decision had already been made. "Is there a problem, officer?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice measured. Briggs didn't blink. "I saw you put something in your bag after scanning a few items. Mind showing me your receipt?" Margaret's brow furrowed. She adjusted the weight of the paper bag in her arms and replied, "I just paid. You can verify that at the register." But Briggs wasn't having it. His jaw set in a tight line. "Show me your receipt," he repeated, the authority in his tone leaving little room for argument. Margaret sighed, careful to move slowly. She reached into the bag and withdrew the crumpled receipt, extending it toward him. Briggs snatched it from her hand, barely glancing at the printed slip before shaking his head. "Nice try," he said flatly. "Empty your pockets." By now, a few shoppers had begun to watch. Their gazes flitted between the two of them like spectators at a tense tennis match. Margaret felt the weight of their stares, but she kept her composure. "I don't have anything in my pockets," she replied steadily. Briggs's patience snapped in an instant. Hands against the counter, he barked. Margaret's jaw tightened. She had seen this exact scenario play out countless times in her years as a public defender. The certainty, the assumption, the refusal to listen. None of it mattered. Her truth, her dignity, her rights. They were secondary to his authority. "I told you," she said, her voice a quiet warning. "I didn't take anything." Briggs wasn't listening. He spoke into his radio, his words clipped and devoid of hesitation. "Dispatch, I have a possible shoplifting suspect refusing to comply." Margaret exhaled slowly. She kept her hands where he could see them, made no sudden moves, and kept her voice calm. She knew it wouldn't matter. Excuse me. I hesitant voice interrupted. It belonged to a young store clerk in a green company vest. The girl stepped forward nervously. "I actually saw her pay for everything." Briggs didn't even turn to look. "Stay out of this," he snapped. Margaret's heart was pounding now, though her face remained impassive. She could see exactly where this was headed. "You're making a mistake," she said, maintaining eye contact. "I have a law degree. I know my rights." Briggs gave a humorless chuckle. "Yeah? Well, you can explain them downtown." Before Margaret could reply, his hand clamped around her wrist. She had a choice. She could resist, demand a supervisor, make a scene. But she knew how that would end. So, she let him. The cold click of metal handcuffs around her wrists echoed louder than any words. A ripple of tension passed through the small store as Briggs led her outside. Margaret caught sight of herself in the reflection of the glass door, shoulders back, head high, cuffs glinting in the afternoon sun. She had represented dozens of people in this exact position. Now, she was one of them, but she knew something Officer Briggs did not. This wasn't going to end the way he thought. The station. The ride to the Ashford Police Department was silent, punctuated only by the static crackle of Briggs's radio. Margaret sat in the back of the cruiser, her hands cuffed behind her as she stared out at the passing streets. Her mind was already working, cataloging each detail, each misstep he had made. Briggs, by contrast, seemed relaxed. One hand on the wheel, the other resting near the radio mic. This wasn't his first time making a questionable arrest. Probably wouldn't be his last. At least, not if he had anything to say about it. They pulled into the station's lot with a jerk of the brakes. Briggs climbed out with the easy nonchalance of someone confident he had everything under control. He opened her door and gestured for her to step out. Margaret did so without resistance, chin lifted. Inside, the front desk officer barely glanced at her as Briggs handed over her wallet and personal effects. "Shoplifting," Briggs said casually. The officer behind the desk, an older man named Sergeant Keller, his gray hair cropped close, raised an eyebrow. "Serious?" Briggs shrugged. "Had to detain her. She was getting hostile." Margaret clenched her jaw. Hostile. The word hung in the air like a loaded accusation. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't even raised her hands. But she was an older black woman in a town where that word meant something dangerous. Another officer, a younger man, maybe in his early 30s, thumbed through her wallet. His eyes narrowed slightly when he pulled out her South Carolina Bar Association card. "She's an attorney," he said, his gaze flicking up to Briggs. Briggs snorted. "Sure she is." The younger officer, his name tag read Ruiz, turned the card over, inspecting it. "She's telling the truth." He looked back at Briggs. "You sure about this charge?" Briggs's face tightened. "She stole from a store." Ruiz didn't argue, but he did hesitate. Then he turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, do you have a lawyer?" Margaret met his eyes, a slow smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "I don't need one." Ruiz blinked. Then he smiled faintly, as if he understood something Briggs did not. He handed her wallet back. "You gonna represent yourself?" Ruiz asked. Margaret nodded. "Absolutely." Briggs let out an annoyed huff and turned away. "Fine. Get her processed." Holding. Margaret was led down a narrow hallway lined with holding cells. She had walked through places like this before, just never on this side of the law. She sat on a cold bench, her hands cuffed in front of her, and waited. She knew the drill. They'd hold her as long as they could, hoping she'd agree to a plea deal or, worse, sit in jail over the weekend for no reason but to teach her a lesson. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. When the guard returned hours later to inform her she was being arraigned in the morning, Margaret was ready. And Officer Daniel Briggs? He still thought he had already won. Courtroom reckoning. Morning came with a metallic clang and the shuffle of footsteps. Margaret stood tall as they brought her into the courtroom, hands cuffed but gaze unwavering. The judge, a tired-looking woman in her 60s named Judge Roberta Quinn, barely glanced up as the clerk read the charges. Margaret Ellison, charged with misdemeanor theft. Margaret cleared her throat. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to motion for immediate dismissal based on lack of evidence and wrongful arrest." Briggs stood by the prosecution's table, smirking. "We have security footage," he said. Margaret's expression didn't waver. "Play it." Judge Quinn gestured to the bailiff. A monitor flickered to life, showing grainy footage from the store's cameras. Margaret was seen at the self-checkout, scanning her items. She reached into her purse and took out her wallet, clearly paying. Moments later, a security guard approached. There was no audio, but it was clear she never pocketed anything. The footage ended. Margaret turned back to the judge. "Not only does this video fail to show any theft," she said, "but it also exonerates me. I paid for my items. The only thing I stole was Officer Briggs's ability to throw his weight around unchecked." Judge Quinn frowned. She turned to Briggs. "Officer, on what basis did you arrest this woman?" Briggs's jaw tightened. The store manager made a complaint. Margaret's eyebrow lifted. "Did they? Or did you pressure them to?" She let the silence stretch. "I requested the store's transaction logs," Margaret continued. "And I have a receipt that matches the exact time of the video footage." There were murmurs in the courtroom. Judge Quinn sighed heavily, rubbing her temple before fixing her gaze on Briggs. "Officer Briggs," she said slowly, "step forward." Briggs hesitated, but he obeyed. "You detained a citizen without probable cause," the judge said. "Worse, you tampered with due process." This is beyond negligence. Briggs paled. Judge Quinn turned to Margaret. Ms. Ellison, you are free to go. Case dismissed. There was a gasp from the gallery, followed by scattered applause. The bailiff unlocked Margaret's cuffs, and she picked up her bag, pausing beside Briggs just long enough to speak. You try to silence me, she said quietly. Now I'll make sure no one else suffers because of your abuse. Briggs's hands clenched at his sides. His once smug expression cracked. Margaret offered a slow, dangerous smile. See you soon, Officer Briggs. She walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. But she wasn't done. Not yet. The beginning of the end. Outside, reporters clustered around the courthouse steps. Microphones and cameras swung in her direction as soon as she appeared. Ms. Ellison, how do you feel about the case being dismissed? Will you be filing charges against Officer Briggs? Margaret raised her hand, and the crowd quieted. She took a deep breath before speaking with deliberate calm. This wasn't just about me, she said. This is about a system that allows people like Officer Briggs to abuse their power unchecked. Today, the truth prevailed. But justice? Justice is still waiting. A murmur of agreement passed through the reporters. Yes, she continued, I will be filing a civil suit against Officer Briggs. And I will be pressing for an independent investigation into his past arrests. Because if he did this to me, how many others have suffered in silence? Cameras flashed. Voices rose. But Margaret's mind was already set. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. She turned and walked down the courthouse steps, her resolve burning brighter than it ever had before. And this time, she wouldn't stop until the entire corrupt system came crashing down.